Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today, we're going to be talking all things vulnerability in elite sport, and we're going to be doing so with Karin Hägglund. Karin, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me on the show.
It's great to have you on. Looking forward to the conversation today. It's going to be really interesting. We're unpacking a research paper you've recently published. But before we get on to that, some introductions. Tell us a little bit about yourself and tell us about your work.
All right. Yes, I'm based in Stockholm, Sweden, at the Swedish School of Sport and Health Sciences, and I'm currently doing my PhD here. But I would say I'm not a young PhD student. I have a long background. I actually started out in health promotion and public health. So I'm not a sports psych and I'm not a psychologist. However, I started in this health promotion, public health, working in my civil career, doing that kind of work, but at the same time being an elite athlete, as a lot of us do. We have those dual careers.
Yeah.
And after I finished my career, I went on as a national team coach. And my sport is karate. So I would say that's like the pillars of my background. And given how all of this fits together today, I usually say, like, my big interest, my big passion is how we can maintain well-being and health while performing at a high level over time. And so today I'm doing research on high performance coaches. And in my research project, my PhD project, we're looking at self-compassion and high performance coaches. But before I was a PhD student here in Sweden, I was actually involved in a few research projects ahead of that. And the paper we're going to speak about today is part of that because it's an ongoing larger project, like devoted to sustainability among high performance coaches here in Sweden. And one of the things that kept reoccurring was vulnerability. And for me personally, vulnerability was not a word that I think I ever used as an athlete. But of course, you get older and things happen in your life, and then you start realizing that you might be vulnerable as a person. And at the same time, I went into coaching, which was a lot more complex role than I ever thought when I was an athlete. I was probably like the normal athlete, like you're focused on yourself and your performance, and your coach is supposed to be there for you. And you don't think too much about what's going on with them, really. And then I stepped into that role and I realized I love it. It was one of the best things I've ever done in my life to be able to work with athletes so closely. I had learned a lot from my own coaches, both good and bad. I always say that I learned a lot from the good things they done, but some of like the bad coaching I received, I also said, I'm just going to do the opposite and I'll probably be fine, you know? But I also realized the complexity of it all by also managing a normal life at the same time, but also going into coaching because it's like, even though the pressure is maybe not as high as an athlete when you go to competitions, it's like that maintenance all over. It's like you never go down. And as an athlete, you prepare, you do your competition, and you kind of relax the other competition days, and then you go home and you go back into training. As a coach, you're always on, like. And I come from a small sport, like karate is not a big sport in Sweden. So the coaches, when we go to competitions, we might not be so many coaches. So we try to help each other out and we take care of everything. And then you have maybe some of the juniors with you. And what are the girls doing over there? And you have to kind of like maintain everything. So the pressure is always on, both on their performance, but also like taking care of everything when you travel, when you're at camps. And when you come back home, it's always that planning of travels and training and competitions. So it was like the complexity was so different than I ever thought as an athlete. And I thought that was so interesting, given that coaches are in one way so central to all of sports. And we a lot of time take it for granted, their passion, their enthusiasm, because it's something that drives us so much because we want to contribute to our athletes, to their development. But we kind of take it for granted sometimes when we're on the other side or outside of that role. That's what I figured, at least. So, long story short here, how I got into research. When I was a national team coach, I got the offer to do an elite coach education that they have here in Sweden that like engages that are coaches already on the national team level to have an education together. Like you meet different sports and so on. And the first course we had was sustainable leadership, and I thought it was so interesting. Also, like coming from my background of health, because I've always been interested in like what makes us healthy, what makes us like what makes life meaningful. Why do we choose the things we do? Like I've always been interested in those parts. And I think I've always chosen to do what I'm passionate about. And the course lead on that course was Dr. Göran Kente, who is today my supervisor. So I got very engaged in that course, and I think I probably overdid a little bit of the examinations because after a while he kind of asked me, "He's like, do you want to do your like the full exam on this topic?" And we started talking about different projects, and he asked me to join this started research project on sustainable leadership. So from that, like from going into different projects, and I was more interested, I think, in the applied side of it. Like, how do we get this across to coaches? Like, what is possible in their worlds when you live a demanding life? How do you get this awareness of your own health, basically, your own well being? But after like a while, I think I also got more and more interested, like, can I do research on this? Like, would it be possible to pursue a PhD? And from that moment on, we tried to get funding, and it took a few years. But like in Sweden, you have to get full funding for 4 years before you can start the education. That's why it was like different projects beforehand. So I think for me, it's also been choosing something that I'm very passionate about going into this, but also being able to really combine my two big interests that's always been with me, like well-being and health and how we maintain that, but then also elite sports and coaching, like how can we maintain our well-being over time, even though we want to pursue and perform in a high demanding context. So yeah, that's a little bit of me.
Fascinating. What a journey. And I'm actually just going to take you back to something that you said at the beginning of your introduction there, that as an athlete yourself, and we're going to be talking predominantly today about coaches and coaching vulnerability as a coach, as you've eloquently spoken about there, the complexity of that landscape. Leads to the importance of the expression of vulnerability, but just dwelling a bit on your athletic career, you as a competitor within karate, you mentioned that vulnerability wasn't really a word that was at the forefront of your mind, possibly in your
No,
mind at all. And I'd
no.
be interested, given what you're researching today, just reflecting back on your athletic career and thinking about how vulnerability wasn't a part of that process at all. What's your thoughts on that? How does that make you feel now? What do you feel that you missed out? Do you think you could have done better or had more joy or extended your career more? What thoughts go through your mind when you think about that?
Oh, thank you for that question. It's a lovely question. I've definitely reflected a bit on that. And I think, like, basically, I think I would have understood it a little bit more beforehand. And this might be different in different cultures and different sports. But, like, given karate, and we have quite a strict hierarchy, and it's very much of like the dominant narrative is definitely, you just go. Like, if you break a leg, you go. If you like, there's very like a male dominance narrative of how we go about things, and it's quite strict. And like um, you only learn to say yes to your coach. Like in karate, you say hi. There's no. You just say yes, and you try everything, and you go. And I think that is one of the parts of it that I was very like formed into that shape of, you know, okay, don't think about it, go, And on the other hand, also, of course, by like, then you go into like national teams and so on. And I remember like one of my first selections, and I told my friend that I was so nervous, and she was just like, but don't say anything. don't say anything because that's going to show that you're weak because, and I think always I think there's different conversations today about how we speak about like, but that nervousness is something that's actually getting you prepared and so on. But we didn't speak about that then. And that is something that I sometimes think about. I think it would have made, I'm not sure if it made me a better athlete, maybe, but I think I would have enjoyed it more and maybe not been as critical to myself if I had known that these were just normal responses to that I was about to perform and I was about to compete and it meant something to me. So, of course, I'm going to be nervous. I'm going to have all these crazy thoughts in my head, but that's normal. And I think just having someone say that, putting yourself out there is making yourself vulnerable. That's what creates this anxiety and stress and so on. Um, so yeah, I think that would have
Mm.
helped quite a lot, and I think that's also what's driving a little bit the kind of research that I want to do today. Like we're going to unpack a little bit of this vulnerability paper today. In my PhD, we've gone through like we're looking at self-compassion, where of course vulnerability is quite central in how they are related to each other. That maybe like the self-compassion can help you take care of yourself in those vulnerable situations.
You transitioned from an athlete into a coach, and
Yeah.
listening to your instant experiences, there's an interesting juxtaposition in as much as on the one hand, it sounded like you almost felt overwhelmed from walking into a world of complexity, and yet at the same time, I also heard you say, what I felt I heard you say was, well, this is fun. I'm going to enjoy this is
Yeah.
great. So they almost sounded like two contradictory positions there, Karin, which I completely understand because I live
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
every single day of my life, I think. So I don't think I can shape that as a question, just a reflection on what I heard you say.
Yeah. And yeah, and I can expand a little bit on
Please.
that because you're like right on point. It's definitely a duality in that. In the one hand, I loved working with my athletes, like actually being with them, training with them, coaching them at competition, having that ongoing interaction of both like getting to know them as people, but then also like trying to get them to develop and see what works and how different individuals work in different settings and how I can help. I love that part. But then, of course, there's another side to it where you also step away just from being with the athletes, and there's a lot of other pressures on that you're facing as a coach with dealing with travels or the like collaborating in the teams or selections. That of course, like you want to work with all your athletes, but at the end of the day, you have to select a few, and all of those things that are complex. So it's definitely a duality in that.
Duality is a great word for it. That was the word I think I was searching for there. So thank you so much. And look, we're here today to unpack a research paper that you've led on alongside Christopher Wagstaff, Joran Kenter, and Richard Thelwell, some real giants of sports psychology world that you're teaming up with there. And the paper is entitled "Starting a Conversation about Vulnerability in Elite Sport." And gave us a plentiful introduction, but just again, a question here around the genesis of this paper. Was this paper as a consequence of the experiences you were stepping into as a coach, that world of complexity? And so what dawned on you was the need perhaps to experience and explore vulnerability in a different way to how you had done as an athlete.
Part of it, but I will also say that given you mentioned my fantastic co-authors on these papers, and they're definitely giants, and I'm learning a lot from them. It's fantastic to get to work with them. And I think for all of us, we had different ways of stepping into this paper, given our different backgrounds and what we've seen in our experiences and so on. For me, it's definitely like I think I always call vulnerability my side passion. Like I have my PhD project on self-compassion, but vulnerability in sports is kind of like a passion that just drives it. That's always been there since I stepped into coaching. So it was a combined thing. Like we started, it was an intervention that me and Dr. Karin Hägglund started. We were just doing like a quite brief intervention with self-reflection. And in those focus group interviews, they started to share narratives of vulnerability. And we can see how that actually helped them in a lot of ways. They increased some help-seeking behavior. They started sharing like more personal narratives and vulnerable narratives with each other. So that kind of like sparked an interest, like maybe this is something that's not only in me, but also could be important to raise in the context of elite sports. So we actually started to ask them what actually vulnerability was, to just see like, okay, so I know what I think about vulnerability, even if it's very hard to define. Uh, so if I would just ask you, what's your definition of vulnerability? That's pretty much the question we ask them. And some of them would just say one word, and one would like share a full story, how they navigate this. Um, so it was definitely like a combined of our own interests. And I think like Jan Kent has been quite interested in the mental health and also the like what he calls the dark side of sports, like the, uh, the mental health side of it. And I think that's where he comes from and going into vulnerability here, that it's so important that we raise it because of the stigma in elite sports of even talking about vulnerability that we always see as a weakness and so on. So it's been I think, a combined of our own interests, but also seeing it when we had research with coaches.
The paper entitled, as I mentioned before, starting a conversation about vulnerability in elite sports. So what objectives did you have here? What did you want to come away from? What you were interested in?
Well, we wanted to create some kind of resources to be able to start a conversation, because what we also realized that it's quite hard to just start talking. Okay, let's talk about vulnerability, because that means that you have to share something of yourself. That's
Mhm.
something like you have to reveal something. But sometimes it's easier if I can like put something on. Like that's why we in this paper founded both resources of word clouds and poems. So you can have something to look upon and just see, okay, what are the reflections coming to me when I see this, and then maybe you can come into your own experiences related to reflections and thoughts when reading poems or looking at the word clouds or discussing them with others. Because I think also one thing that I think is important with vulnerability, it's also that it's not something that we might want to share with everyone all the time. It's something that it's part of our integrity as well. But the main thing is to be able to recognize it for yourself. As your question before about me as an athlete, I didn't even understand it, so I couldn't even recognize it to myself. Like, what is this? What is this coming from? I didn't have a word for it. I didn't know. So I think, and then being able to share more with knowing when to share, how much, to whom, and so on, and be able to do that in a safe environment. So I think we wanted to just be able to, the objectives here is to be able to create resources to start these conversations. And we have in the paper outlined a process how you can do it, but we also really wanted to be like, we don't want to prescribe exactly how to do this. Like you can take what we outlined, or you can just use the poems or word clouds just as they are and how they fit into your practice or a workshop and so on.
I'm lifting from your paper here a quote from Michael Phelps, the winner of 28 Olympic
Yeah.
medals, who said, "For the longest time, I thought asking for help was a sign of weakness because that's kind of what society teaches us. That's especially true from an athlete's perspective. If we ask for help, then we're not this big macho athlete that people can look up to." And to speak to your point, confusing for athletes and for coaches as well can be, well, who am I vulnerable to? When should I be vulnerable? How much, as you said, how much should I expose of myself?
Yeah.
I suppose my question here more relates to why, and maybe the answer is obvious, and maybe if Michael Phelps has given us one reason, but why for you is elite sport so awkward around vulnerability? What is it about elite sports, whether for athletes or for coaches, that scares the hell out of its participants when it comes to or with relation to vulnerability?
Ooh. One way, obvious answer, but like if you think about it, it's quite a difficult question because as a society, it in many ways also scares vulnerability, but even more maybe in elite sports. And
Yeah,
I guess it all comes down to at the end of the day that we're so wired to that, doing more is always better. Like training more is always better. Having that singular focus is always the best. So that we're quite scared that if I put my attention on something else, that it will take
yeah.
away from my performance.
Can I dwell on that taking away? Because you as a coach, is there any, maybe there isn't because of what you do from the research side of things, but is there any part of you, any kind of intuitive part of you as a coach that is fearful of the athlete who is vulnerable with a competition coming up, or you've got to select that person or think about selecting that person, but they've spoken about some personal challenges? Is there any part of you as a coach that gets fearful of selecting that athlete because of their experiences, their vulnerable experiences?
Good question.
Because I get it. I get it why coaches can get, because it's their it can be their living. It can be, to choose an athlete who is having uncomfortable experiences.
Yeah, but at the same time, I think we know more and more also that we can perform even though we're not having the best mental health or we're going through difficult circumstances. I think we have more and more like proof of that
Yes.
among athletes. I think here, stepping into the role of a coach, I think we have less of that. Given how much attention we have this week on a soccer coach just saying that I don't have the energy anymore.
Yes. Yes. Jurgen Klopp.
Yeah, yeah. So we have not so many stories from coaches yet, because if we have been used to having athletes having like being very like should be those
Mhm.
superheroes as Phelps talk about and have that singular focus and more is always better. I think it's even more true sometimes with coaches that like it's also the demands of the role that it takes a lot of time, but also going into a different narrative of being a strong leader. That who can I tell about these things? Can I talk to my athletes? I think that would be my insecurity as a coach. Like, am I allowed to? And what can I tell my athletes or my support staff about how I am doing? And I think that's a conversation that needs to be had. That what kind of like support system do we have for coaches today? We're like in the
Mm.
middle here in Sweden right now with a lot of data collection, and some of their coaches have also expressed, "Well, I tried to reach out for help, but no one was there.
Mm.
Like, who was the receiver? Like, so sometimes yes, it's a high threshold of asking for help, but we also like who will provide that help or support." So I think I can definitely see how a coach would be a little bit insecure about choosing someone. But I think we're having those conversations more and more about athletes being able to perform. But I think looking at the interview with Klopp this week, we also see that he's saying he's running out of energy, but he's very clear about that he's fine now. He has all the energy. to do this season, and really like showing that he's all in 100% quite strongly in that interview.
I'm going to pick out a couple of things that you said there, which I think are really interesting, and we need more conversation around this. You mentioned there that mental ill health isn't necessarily experienced to the detriment of sporting performance. It's something backed up by a growing body of empirical research. We had Professor Rosemary Purcell and Dr. Courtney Walton on the Sports Psych Show episode 190, who they spoke to this, and they've built a model around this notion that, hey, somebody experiencing mental ill health can still go out and perform, can learn and can perform. That's the number one thing. So I really, really love that lens. The second thing I love about what you've said there is that socio-cultural landscape whereby we've been so socialized in sport into the strong person, if you like, and that more is better. And what it made me think, you were saying there that really there's not enough stories at the moment of the experience of vulnerability and how people have reached out for help, and that has resulted in better experiences and still good performances within sport. Because we've been socialized into this strong person, more is better, I'll just do it anyway, and don't talk about it. That has tended to be the prevailing narrative in sport as stories grow. And I just wonder, as much as social media and platforms like X can be a problem for our mental health, equally, I am definitely trapping videos every single day of athletes in press conferences talking about mindfulness, meditation, self-compassion, the tools and the techniques, particularly from the NFL, the NBA in America, where mental health practitioners have been mandated into teams, organizations. So those stories are starting to arrive, and the landscape, as you said, is starting to shift.
Yeah, definitely. And I think what you say here is also that today we speak about like mindfulness and self-compassion being a part of an athlete's life.
Yeah,
but it's a little bit different how we speak about coaches and what's part of their life. And I think that has spurred my interest so much. Like, how can we provide support, or what could provide support in this kind of very complex role and demanding life? And also that you have this quite strong male culture where we might not be so used to showing vulnerability or so on.
absolutely. And here's me getting slightly carried away with the athlete side of things. And of course, this paper is about coaching vulnerability. And as you mentioned there, Jurgen Klopp has spoken about not having enough energy uh, in his tank to keep going forever. I think we all want him to keep going forever because he is an amazing human being and he's such a wonderful coach.
Yeah.
But equally, over in Spain at the moment, Javi Hernandez, legendary player for Barcelona, and now their head coach for the last few years, is stepping down from his role and I think he has said himself, for his own mental health. So again, some stories starting to come through, and people and coaches starting to feel more comfortable to talk about their well-being and their mental health and being vulnerable. In terms of starting that story, in this paper, you're promoting the idea of the collection of words and the formulation of poems. Karin, talk to me a little bit about this. Where are we going?
Words and poems. Yeah, words and poems. Well, given like always like how you should present things and how we can get people to get engaged like emotionally in things. I think just like even though that could probably be disputed, but like just being able to outline a few poems to really get across the different sides of vulnerability as we've seen it in our research. When our coaches talked about vulnerability, the definitions I spoke about that we asked them to just write down, um, we just noticed there were quite two different themes. That one was like the traditional one, that this is weakness, this is me not wanting to ask for help, this is vulnerability to me, something that I don't want to show. But we also had this contrasting theme where a lot of them also spoke about that this is what makes me human. This is where I'm able to connect in an authentic way with other people, with my athletes or with my close ones or so on. So I have to admit my vulnerabilities, even though it's hard. Like it's not so easy. So I think what I would like to do, because we constructed two poems, and I'll read them. And I'll ask you, Dan, to give your reflections after hearing.
Go for it.
But I think I'm taking one at a time. I'll start with the traditional one that's called Weakness. Just so for the listeners, these poems are constructed with like the sole words of high performance coaches as they defined vulnerability. Um, so we just constructed them into poems. So here I go. Vulnerability, you say. That would be lowering my guard. To ask for help, show a weak spot. You see, I want to be able to do it all. Never ask for help. The whole thing about receiving help makes me feel weak, fragile, awakes fear of not being respected, of doing it wrong, of not being good enough. Vulnerability, you ask. I fake it, say that it's all good, even though I don't feel that way. Don't want to show when I'm fragile, uncertain, when I can't do it, when someone close to me is hurting, when I cannot help, when I feel pain and hurt inside. You know, it's dark, even though the sun shines. I guess I could ask for help when I'm not enough, admit my weaknesses. Vulnerability, you say, more difficult to explain than I thought.
Okay. You would like me to reflect back what I heard, what that made me think about.
Yeah, yeah,
I think at the first few lines, it was making me think about the fear of being honest and opening up, that might expose me in some way.
yeah,
Um, am I a fraud? Am I good enough? The admittance of being weak, and that is a bad thing. Um,
yeah, yeah.
I think ego came through there, that
Mhm.
you're forced into a position of ego in coaching, and that's the narrative, and so I have to demonstrate ego because that's how it's done. um, Being inauthentic, is what I need to be. um, Putting on a mask,
Yeah,
and a fear of, I think towards the end there, it was kind of a fear of
yeah.
being uncertain, that everything has to be certain. I have to be certain. I have to live in this certain world. And
Mhm.
if I don't, as a coach, maybe because as a coach, I almost trade on certainty with my athletes, that it's not a,
Yeah,
that it's not a good thing. It feels a little bit chaotic and all over the place. Those, those are, I think, the kind of things that were coming through to me.
yeah, yeah. That's really interesting to hear. And I think it also made me think of another episode you have here on vulnerability, with how we're dealing with uncertainty and vulnerability, because it's like uncertainty is part of coaching, but then we try instead to be very certain. And maybe that's also one of the reasons we don't want to display vulnerability.
Yeah, and it just dwelling on that, I know I've been, as a sports psychologist, guilty is the wrong word, because I think sometimes trading in certainty as a coach, you're helping people with things like tactics and technique and stuff like that. And so delivering with a form of certainty, I think, is important. So I think that's not unimportant certainty, but I do think you have to be able to flex into a world where you understand that you are coaching in a world of uncertainty, and it's okay to experience that as well. That both worlds can exist simultaneously. That
Hmm.
dualistic position, always that duality.
Yeah, always that duality. And I really agree with you, because one of the things when you're a coach, you
Mm,
deliver with certainty. Or when you're at a competition and someone asks you a thing, even though you might not have the full answer, but you know you can take care of it, you will say, yes, it's like this, and you will take care of it because you create a security for your athletes. So I think that's a duality that you might deliver
mm,
with certainty. But however, how you respond to yourself and being able to admit or ask for help, that might be also negative effects for you if you cannot admit these kind of
mm.
things. For us, it's been quite interesting because we've used this both like in education forums, workshops, but also in some research interviews, to get these conversations started and reflections. And one of the things that come across sometimes is that when they look at this poem weakness, when we've interviewed more experienced high performance coaches, is this is definitely me when I was younger.
Okay.
So it's also maybe something about like growing into the role, but also, of course, how it's modeled from above. Like if all the strong leaders never ask for help, all the great coaches never ask for help, never display any kind of vulnerability. Of course, you think you're going to have to model that when you're a young coach. And that's why I also think what the week's events has been quite useful in the way that we can start talking. We get different stories now from the fantastic coaches in the world. So I think that's one of the things that you can really see here, that it might be most young coaches, but also how we model coaching. This is maybe more the traditional modeling of coaching.
Really, really interesting. And there's a second poem.
There's a second poem that is called To Be Human. Here we go. Vital. That's vulnerability to me. Allowing myself to feel, being honest to myself about who I am, how I'm feeling, inviting my close ones into my core, being authentic. To put it simply, to be human, that's vulnerability. We all have flaws, but also strength. Nobody's perfect. I'm at peace with that. When I show my vulnerability, speak on my concerns, I sometimes feel uncomfortable. Yeah, it's difficult at times to follow through. But I've noticed it's often received positively, with compassion. Connection with others becomes deeper, authentic. I grow inside. When I show my vulnerability, I feel brave and strong, become stronger and wiser. I can handle failure, pain, and suffering. I learn from it. The way I see it, being vulnerable is simply the core of being human, daring to be authentic.
So things I got from that, that expressing vulnerability, being authentic, is important because that's what it is to be human. Vulnerability is human because we are thinking, feeling, emotional creatures. Its feeling is part of our human functioning. So to deny it is to deny what it is to be a human being, which really resonates with me because I've had so many competitors at the elite level of
Mhm.
sport. And I know we're talking about coaches, but it still goes hand in hand, who have said, well, we feel like we're treated like machines, or we feel like we have to be machines. Um, that this idea of, I have flaws, but I've also got strengths. And actually, if we just walk around thinking that we only have strengths and we only have to demonstrate strengths, again, it's ridiculous, because as a human being, to have strengths, you're also going to have flaws or weaknesses, if you want to use that term. Also, as you were speaking, as you were delivering that poem, I was thinking of, that there's a real difficulty of opening up and
Yep.
talking about this stuff. But when you do it, it brings with it several things. It can build connections, you can find more solutions
Yeah.
around emotional management. Maybe you can start to think about emotions in more granular detail, which I know is a really important thing. Having spoken to Lisa Feldman Barrett about this as well on the podcast, and just more solutions around experience, the experiences that you have.
Yeah.
So actually, by opening up, admitting vulnerability, whether it's talking or thinking or looking for written resources or something, actually, by starting that process, you can potentially have more go-to mechanisms, tools, techniques, skills, resources, solutions in the future for when you need them. Those were
Yeah.
the kind of things that came through to me there.
Thank you so much for sharing. And first of all, like, no, like, don't apologize for going to athletes, because I think these resources will be as much of use with athletes as with coaches, and maybe more bridge this, because as you say that a lot of athletes can feel that they're supposed to be
Mm.
machines. I think, like, sharing that, I think some coaches can feel exactly the same thing, uh, that you just have to perform all the time, and there's no understanding from maybe federations or organizations and so on in the demands that they face. So there might be more common experience than you would think. But of course, the athlete's going to feel that from the coach, but there's that understanding that I think sometimes is missing. Just as I felt myself as an athlete, I never thought about my coach. Like, you don't really make that connections. And of course, you cannot share maybe everything, but maybe having those more honest conversations also can also create a more psychological safe environment for both athletes and coaches to be human and be able to, like, act in a more authentic way or display vulnerability when they need to or so.
Would you be able to share, and please excuse me, I don't know how many times you've exposed coaches to these poems or these words, but what kind of responses do you get from from coaches?
I'll start by saying that a lot of times, like in all of my research, is that my experience is that a lot of times when we go in or we do an intervention and we start talking about sustainability or self-compassion or vulnerability, their own well-being, just it's is something that they never really spoke about before, because they're not so often asked about those kind of things. And it's also a moment for them to start that reflection process, thinking about themselves, because they're also quite primed to thinking about others, thinking about their athletes. Uh, they come second to themselves a lot of times. So that's one thing. But then, more specifically with these poems, I'll share one interesting reflection, that the first poem, Weakness, was seen as a poem like, yeah, this is usually who I am when I coach. And the second poem, To Be Human, is that's where I would like to be, or that's the process I want to be able to go through and be more like. But it's quite hard given context or given how they think they should play the role, or what others think of them. Um, but I think this is also what we've learned is usually like a learning process over time for those who are still in the game. However, I think we lose a lot of people as coaches, like competent coaches who has a lot of passion and drive, but it's hard to fit this really tough role of that's quite lonely, and you're supposed to be a strong leader, and you might not have too many to confide in.
Again, it makes me think of the socio-cultural landscape and how that landscape pressures coaches into being performative a lot of the time.
Yep. Yep.
And when you think about your own coaching career, would you say that historically you've had to be quite performative,
Um,
or is that something that you've embraced that vulnerability from quite early in your coaching?
I would say I tried, but it's quite difficult.
Hmm.
uh, I definitely try to be quite open and authentic with my athletes, because I think that's the only way you can get a good connection, and to build a relationship, to be able to actually coach someone. Um, However, it's from where I was at that point in that context, it was not really how things were done. So you can also get in complexity with other coaches that have other coaching styles. So I think that's also like a bit of that landscape. Uh, it's not so easy to be the only one trying to make a difference.
Do you therefore think, if it's enormously challenging for coaches to express vulnerability or their authentic selves with their athletes, for example, younger athletes, older athletes alike, maybe younger athletes, their attitude is influenced by their parents. There's a lot of pressures on attitudes from around an athlete. Do you therefore think that coaches need to seek mentors, psychologists, other coaches, critical friends?
Definitely, definitely. However, I don't think that we should put like the sole pressure on the coaches. I think there's more to do around structure and organizations to provide that, because I think sometimes if you already are facing a lot of demands, to put more pressure on by saying, "Oh, you should also be trying to seek out mentors and sports psychologists and so on." Like they're so used, like as one of our coaches said in one of our projects, like I always know who to call when my athletes need help. I don't know who to call myself. But you don't really have, like, where do I have the time to seek that out? So I think it's of course a responsibility for the coaches as well, but I think also to from a research point of view, from an organization's point of view, that we really should illuminate the needs of coaches in a different way, in a better way, to also be able to support their athletes better, because as of today, when we also added the demand of mental health literacy on coaches, that's quite high demands to be able to detect signs of depression and anxiety and eating disorders. And you should be able to have these difficult conversations that are quite hard. Like, how do you ask these questions that are really sensitive? And if we're not at the same time providing more support to coaches when we're asking more of them, uh, I think it's not going to work. We're going to lose more coaches. Like, we're going to hear more coaches saying, "I don't have the energy," or "I cannot cope with all of these pressures," or "I can't handle having these conversations. I don't know what to do." Um, so I think uh, also very aligned with the whole movement of mental health in sports that's been very dedicated on athletes. But I think really seeing that also, that makes it a little bit more pressure on coaches today to be able to take in the mental health side of athletes. That it's because it cannot only be on sports psych, right? Because the relationship between the athlete and the coach is so central. Uh, they have to be involved. They have to know about these things, but we have to support them also both as a performer themselves, but also so they can support athletes. I think this is not, it's of course combined. It's that relationship, coach athlete, that is so central.
Karin, you mentioned that this paper is part of a broader line of research. So
Yeah.
what's next? What's going on at the moment for you in this line of research?
We are conducting studies on self-compassion with high performance coaches
Okay.
to see, given that we know from the research with athletes and self-compassion that this might be a construct, a concept that can help, that can support to meet all of these challenges in elite sports, that to help with rumination or stress and anxiety. But we don't know so much about how, if this also could support coaches. We know a little bit about mindfulness, and of course, mindfulness is part of self-compassion. It's very much intertwined constructs. But um, we know a little bit about mindfulness and coaches, but we don't know anything about self-compassion.
And we've had plenty of episodes on the Sports Psych Show speaking about self-compassion, and the most recent one being Dr. Paul Mansell and Dr. Katie Sparks. So it's a burgeoning area in sports psychology,
Yeah,
not potentially just for athletes, but also for coaches themselves. That makes inherent sense to me. Inherent sense.
yeah.
Okay, look, what an absolutely fascinating conversation, and I can't thank you enough for your time today. And I know that you will have tapped the interest of everybody listening in. So, how can people find you, follow you, and get in touch and potentially get hold of this paper?
The paper, I'll start with that most interesting part. The paper is an open access paper. And it's I have on Twitter, or X we
Yep.
call it today. I have an X account. I'm not very active, but I always put papers out, and it's there. If you just scroll down,
Okay.
it's there, the vulnerability paper, and my X handle is my name, so you can find me there. Even though I'm not very active of posting a lot of stuff, I always like check it. So if you want to send a DM there, you can do that, or you can reach me at email karen.hagglund@gih.se. So that's probably the easiest way to get a hold of me. We always try to be quite deliberate of publishing open access so everyone can read. Yeah.
Brilliant. Fantastic. Karin, I can't thank you enough for today. Thank you so much.
I'm so happy and so honored that you invited me to the show to speak about this paper.
Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook, or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.